right now. Not in a minute, right now. Clasp your hands together in front of your chest like you're about to pray, and press your palms into each other as hard as you comfortably can. Keep pressing. Don't stop until I tell you to. Nothing is moving. No joint is bending. Your hands look, from the outside, like they're doing absolutely nothing. And yet somewhere behind your ribs, your blood pressure just ticked upward, and in about 90 seconds your vessels are going to start doing something that a British research team, pooling data from 270 separate clinical trials, found lowers resting blood pressure more reliably than jogging does. Not a supplement, not a detox, a squeeze, and then a release. You can let go now. Here's the number that made cardiologists pay attention. In 2023, researchers led by Jamie O'Driscoll at Canterbury Christ Church University in the UK analysed those 270 trials, nearly 16,000 people combined, comparing 5 categories of exercise for lowering resting blood pressure: aerobic training, weightlifting, combined training, high-intensity intervals, and isometric holds, meaning pressing against something immovable and doing nothing else. The isometric holds won, for both the top number and the bottom number, by a wide margin. And of every isometric exercise tested, one simple, unglamorous move outperformed the rest: the wall squat. This isn't a video about biohacking or ancient wisdom nobody can verify. There's no secret herb here. There is a blood vessel, a gas your own cells manufacture, a nerve reflex that's been running since before you were born, and a plain accounting of what a wall sit and 20 ordinary squats can and cannot do for a body past 60. By the end, you'll be able to explain, in one sentence, why doing nothing while pressing hard against a wall changes how your blood vessels behave, and why pairing that with something as unremarkable as 20 squats reaches an entirely separate set of tissue that a static hold never touches. One thing this video will not do is promise you extra years of life, because no honest reading of the research supports a specific number, and a title implying one would be oversimplifying real science for the sake of a hook. What the evidence actually supports is a more useful idea. Health span, meaning the years you spend capable, upright, and doing what you want without needing help, as distinct from lifespan, meaning simply how long the heart keeps beating. Everything from here forward is about health span. That's a real, measurable, worthwhile target, even without an invented number of years bolted onto it. Let's start with what you can actually feel, because feeling always arrives before understanding. Hold a wall sit right now if you're able to. Back flat against a wall, sliding down until your knees are somewhere between a shallow bend and 90 degrees, like sitting in a chair that isn't there. Around the 20-second mark, a burn shows up, usually in the front of the thigh. That burn isn't your muscle failing, it's chemistry. When a muscle contracts hard and holds the contraction, the fibers swell and stiffen, and because your blood vessels run directly through the muscle tissue, threaded between the fibers the way wiring runs through a wall. A hard enough squeeze pinches those vessels closed, the way a fist closes around a garden hose. Blood flow into the working muscle drops towards zero for as long as you hold it. Here's the part almost nobody expects. While you're holding it, your blood pressure is not going down, it's going up, sometimes considerably. Researchers who've measured people mid-wall sit have recorded systolic pressure, the top number, climbing well past what a moderate jog produces, purely from the mechanical effort of maintaining the squeeze. If the story stopped there, you'd reasonably conclude that isometric holds are bad for blood pressure. That conclusion would be exactly backwards, and understanding why is the whole point of what comes next. The garden hose is still useful here. Think about what happens the instant you release a hose that's been pinched shut. Water doesn't trickle back in, it surges. That's what happens inside your muscle the moment you release an isometric hold. The vessels that were compressed spring open, and blood that had been queued up behind the blockage rushes through all at once. Physiologists call this reactive hyperemia, and it isn't subtle. Flow can temporarily overshoot well past its resting rate. That surge does something specific to the paper-thin layer of cells lining the inside of your blood vessels, called the endothelium. As blood rushes across that surface, it creates friction. what physicists call shear stress. And endothelial cells are built specifically to detect that friction. In response, they switch on an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which produces a gas, nitric oxide. That gas diffuses into the smooth muscle wrapped around the vessel and tells it to relax. The vessel widens, pressure inside it drops. So here's the actual chain, stated plainly, because this is the aha the first half of this video is built around. The squeeze cuts off flow. The release causes a surge. The surge causes friction. The friction triggers a gas. The gas relaxes the vessel. A completely motionless hold produces a genuinely dynamic cardiovascular event. It's just delayed until the instant you let go. One rep of that doesn't permanently change your resting blood pressure any more than one good night's sleep fixes chronic insomnia. But researchers suspect two things happen with repetition. First, that shear stress signal, repeated most days over several weeks, appears to recalibrate the baseline tone the vessel sits at, even when you're not squeezing anything. Second, and this part is less settled, so I'll flag it as such. Some physiologists studying isometric training suspect the sympathetic nerves that constantly fine-tune how tightly your vessels stay clamped shut become somewhat less reactive with repeated exposure, essentially turning down a background dial rather than only widening one pipe. That second mechanism is plausible and actively being studied, not yet established the way the nitric oxide pathway is. It helps to separate two different clocks here, because conflating them is a common source of confusion. In the hours immediately after almost any vigorous exercise, including a single isometric hold, blood pressure typically dips below its usual resting level for a while, a well-documented short-term phenomenon called post-exercise hypotension. That dip fades by the next day and isn't the effect we've been building toward. The chronic effect, the actual lowering of your baseline day-to-day resting blood pressure, is a slower, separate process built from weeks of repeated shear stress signaling, not from any single session's temporary dip. Confusing the two is why some people check their blood pressure right after one wall sit, see a nice drop, and mistakenly assume the whole mechanism is that simple. Here are the actual numbers. In that 2023 analysis, isometric training as a category dropped systolic blood pressure by an average of roughly 8 points, with diastolic pressure, the bottom number, falling by an additional 4 points on average, compared to about 4.5 points systolic for aerobic training. The category that includes running, the exercise your doctor has probably recommended for 40 years. When researchers isolated which specific isometric exercise did the most work, the wall squat came out ahead of hand grip squeezes and single leg holds, with average systolic reductions in several trials landing around 10 points. Some reviewers examining this body of research have described reductions of that size as comparable in magnitude to what a single blood pressure medication typically achieves. That's a comparison of size, not a substitute for medical care. If you're on blood pressure medication, this is useful context for a conversation with your doctor, not a reason to change anything on your own. That opening hand press, by the way, wasn't a random choice for a hook. Grip strength itself, the amount of force your hand can produce against resistance, has been studied separately as a marker of overall health. A large multinational study called PURE, following more than 140,000 adults across 17 countries, found that grip strength predicted death from any cause, and specifically from cardiovascular causes, even more strongly than systolic blood pressure did within the same statistical models. Nobody is claiming a firmer handshake causes a longer life. It's more likely a marker, since weaker grip often reflects the same underlying loss of muscle and nerve function we've been discussing this whole time. But it's a strikingly cheap, 10-second way to get an honest read on where you currently stand. Quick pause, because I promised this wouldn't be a passive lecture. Notice, right now, where the burn from that earlier hand press or wall sit is fading from, that's roughly where the vessels you just pinched shut were running. Now, the isometric hold is only half of what this video promised, and here's where the story genuinely turns a corner instead of circling back. Squats. The moving version, 20 repetitions, down and up. Do something a static hold structurally cannot do, because a squat isn't just tension, It's tension combined with a loaded range of motion, and that combination speaks to a completely different set of tissues. Start again with what you can feel. 20 slow, controlled squats produce a different fatigue than a hold does. Less a single sustained burn, more a rising ache that builds rep by rep, sometimes with visible shaking in the legs by rep 15 or so. That shaking has a specific cause. Your nervous system is recruiting motor units. A motor unit is one nerve cell plus every muscle fiber it controls, and your body doesn't switch all of them on at once. It follows a strict order, described decades ago by the neuroscientist Elwood Henneman and known since as the size principle. Small, fatigue-resistant motor units fire first, for easy tasks, and only as demand increases, whether from heavier load or accumulating fatigue in the later reps. Does your nervous system reach for the larger, more powerful units held in reserve? The shake on rep 18 is your body calling in reinforcements it never bothers to use for an ordinary walk to the kitchen. Those larger, later recruited units have a name: type EE, or fast twitch fibers, built for quick, powerful output rather than endurance. Type E, or slow twitch fibers, handle posture and gentle daily movement and barely fatigue at all. Here's why the recruitment order matters specifically for you. Type E fibers are also the ones aging shrinks and disconnects from their nerves first and fastest. A 20-rep set of squats, precisely because it's demanding enough to force your nervous system to reach past the easy fibers, is one of the few ordinary daily activities that still asks anything at all of the very fibers most at risk of quietly disappearing. This matters enormously for a reason most people over 60 have never heard stated plainly. You are losing muscle right now, and have been for a while, whether or not you can feel it. Adults typically lose somewhere around 3 to 5% of muscle mass per decade starting in their 30s, and that loss visibly accelerates once you pass 60. A more important detail than the size loss, and one almost nobody mentions, is this: strength disappears faster than muscle size does. In longer studies tracking the same people over years, strength has been measured declining 2 to 5 times faster than the muscle tissue itself shrinks. That mismatch happens because aging doesn't only shrink muscle fibers. It also causes a slow disconnection between nerves and the fibers they use to control, a process researchers call denervation, which affects the fast, powerful fibers you'd rely on to catch yourself mid-stumble more than the slower ones you use for standing still. This whole picture has a name: sarcopenia, from Greek words meaning roughly poverty of flesh. And it isn't a disease you either have or don't have. It's a spectrum every one of us sits somewhere on, moving in one direction unless something intervenes. Here's where the squat becomes more than incidental movement. Loading a muscle under your own body weight, repeatedly, through a genuine range of motion, is one of the most reliably documented ways to slow, and in some cases partially reverse, that nerve-to-muscle disconnection. The mechanical tension on a muscle fiber during the lowering and rising phases of a squat activates a signaling pathway inside the cell called mTOR, short for mechanistic target of rapamycin, which functions something like the cell's construction supervisor, deciding whether to build new contractile protein or let existing protein break down unreplaced. Tension turns that supervisor's attention toward building. No tension, and there's no signal authorizing new construction. That construction supervisor also works faster with the right materials on site. Research on muscle protein metabolism in older adults, including work associated with nutrition scientists like Elena Volpe, has found that aging muscle becomes somewhat less responsive to a given amount of dietary protein, a phenomenon sometimes called anabolic resistance, and that protein, rich in the amino acid leucine, concentrated in foods like eggs, dairy, and meat, appears to help push past that resistance more effectively than protein lacking it. None of this replaces the mechanical signal from the squat itself. Tension is still what opens the door. Protein simply supplies what walks through it once it's open. There's a second structure listening to that same tension, one people almost never consider mid-squat: your bones. A squat loads your femurs, hips, and spine with genuine compressive force, your body weight transmitted through the joint on every rep. Buried inside bone tissue are cells called osteocytes, whose entire job is sensing mechanical strain. When they detect load, they reduce their output of a protein called sclerostin, which normally acts as a brake on new bone formation. Less sclerostin means less braking, which frees the cells responsible for building bone, called osteoblasts, to lay down fresh tissue exactly where the strain occurred. This isn't a new discovery. The German anatomist Julius Wolff described bone's tendency to remodel itself according to the loads placed on it back in the 1890s. Modern bone biology has simply filled in the molecular detail he couldn't see with the tools of his time. Your skeleton behaves less like an inert scaffold and more like a construction site that keeps sending crews wherever the trucks keep driving. This matters especially for women past menopause, when declining estrogen accelerates bone loss independent of activity level, which makes the mechanical loading signal from something like a squat comparatively more important to supply deliberately, not less. Worth sitting with for a second. The muscle and the bone are reading the exact same signal, mechanical tension, through two entirely separate internal messaging systems, one conversation between your effort and your tissue, two departments listening in. There's a third listener too, and this one connects directly to why people fall. Squatting repeatedly through a real range of motion stimulates sensors inside the muscle itself, called muscle spindles, along with receptors in the joint capsule, that continuously report your body's position in space back to the cerebellum, the part of the brain handling balance and coordination. This sensory feedback loop, not just raw leg strength, is a large part of what lets you catch yourself when you stumble on an uneven sidewalk instead of going down. A squat trains the strength to recover from a stumble and the sensory reporting system that decides how fast your brain even notices you're off balance in the first place. Two different jobs, done by the same rep. Here's where this connects to something almost nobody expects a squat to have anything to do with: how you get up off the floor. In 2012, a Brazilian physician named Claudio Gil Araujo published a study that's quietly become one of the more cited pieces of aging research from the last 15 years. Working out of a clinic in Rio de Janeiro, he and his colleagues tested 2,000 adults between 51 and 80 years old on something almost comically simple. Sit down on the floor, then stand back up, using as little help from your hands, knees, or nearby furniture as possible. Score it 0 to 10. Then they tracked who was still alive roughly 6 years later. People who scored in the lowest range, meaning they needed real support just to get down and up, were 5 to 6 times more likely to have died during the follow-up period than people who scored a near-perfect 10. 5 to 6 times, from a test involving no treadmill, no blood panel, no stethoscope. It measures almost exactly the movement pattern of a squat. Bending deeply at the hips and knees and standing back up using leg strength and balance instead of momentum or furniture. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets stretched into something it isn't, and I told you this video wouldn't do that. That study shows correlation, not proof, that the ability to squat caused those people to live longer. People with stronger legs and better balance likely also carry less underlying illness overall, move more throughout an ordinary day, and eat and sleep differently. A dozen tangled threads. What the study shows cleanly is that the specific capacity a squat trains is strongly associated with who's still alive years later. That correlation is still worth taking seriously, because unlike most mortality risk factors, this one is directly trainable in your kitchen in under 2 minutes a day. This connects to a number that isn't from a research paper at all, just national injury statistics. About 1 in 4 adults over 65 falls at least once a year, according to the CDC, and falls remain the leading cause of injury-related death in that age group. A fall usually isn't one dramatic loss of balance out of nowhere. More often, it's the accumulation of everything we just covered. Fast twitch fibers that respond a beat too slowly, a sensory feedback loop that's grown sluggish, bone that's lost some ability to absorb impact without breaking. And bone matters here in a way that's easy to underestimate. Across multiple large studies, somewhere between roughly 1 in 6 and 1 in 3 people who fracture a hip past 65 die within the following year, not usually from the fracture itself, but from the cascade of immobility, complications, and lost independence that follows it. The overwhelming majority of hip fractures in older adults start with an ordinary, low-energy fall. A stumble on a rug, a missed step, not a car accident or a dramatic collapse. Which is exactly the category of event the strength and balance we've been discussing is positioned to prevent. 20 squats a day is not a fall prevention guarantee. It is a direct daily rehearsal of the strength, bone loading, and balance sensing pattern that a real catch-yourself moment actually requires. Something an ordinary walk on a flat sidewalk simply doesn't demand of your body. There's a related, and perhaps more familiar, version of this used constantly in physical therapy clinics. The 30-second chair stand test, part of a broader senior fitness assessment used across geriatric care. A therapist simply counts how many times you can stand fully up from a seated position and sit back down in 30 seconds without using your hands. It isn't the same test as the floor-based one from the Araujo study, but it's built on the same underlying capacity, and its scores are used clinically, right now, to help flag which older patients are at elevated risk of falling. 20 squats a day, practiced with your own kitchen chair, is effectively daily rehearsal for a test your own doctor's office might one day use to assess you. If you've made it this far, here's the one thing worth doing before we move on, not later. Try the sitting rising test once today, carefully, near something sturdy to hold if needed, and just notice your honest score. Not to panic about it, just to have an actual number to compare against in a few months. Now, the honesty pass, because you've earned it, and because it makes everything already said more trustworthy rather than less. 3 things are strongly established, with decades of converging evidence behind them. That Isometric holds measurably lower resting blood pressure across dozens of controlled trials, that resistance-type loading, like squatting, is among the most effective known tools for slowing age-related muscle and strength loss, and that bone responds to mechanical loading by increasing formation. One thing is established, but modest, and deserves plain language instead of drama. The blood pressure effect, while real and repeatable, generally runs in the range of a handful of points on the cuff, not a cure for hypertension, and most of the underlying trials use sessions 3 times a week rather than strictly every day, so daily practice is a reasonable extension of the evidence, not something every single trial specifically tested. And one thing is genuine inference rather than direct proof. No controlled trial has taken the exact combination of 4 minutes of isometric holding plus 20 daily squats and measured whether it prevents falls or extends life. What exists is strong evidence for each individual mechanism, and a reasonable, though not yet directly tested, expectation that combining them compounds the benefit rather than working against it. One more honest caveat worth naming. Much of the isometric blood pressure research pools adults across a wide age range, not exclusively people over 60. So the size of the effect specifically in an older population is inferred from the broader dataset rather than measured in isolation. That's a reasonable inference, not a gap that erases the finding, but it's a gap worth knowing about. So, practically, here's what this looks like in an actual day, and every piece connects back to a mechanism we just spent several minutes explaining, not to generic advice you could find anywhere. First, the isometric hold. The wall sit is the best studied version. Back flat against a wall, feet planted a comfortable distance out, knees bent somewhere between a gentle angle and 90 degrees. Favor the shallower angle if you're newer to this or have any blood pressure concerns, since a shallower knee angle produces a noticeably smaller pressure spike during the hold than a full 90-degree position does, based on direct comparisons researchers have made across different joint angles. Hold somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, breathing continuously and normally the whole time. Do not hold your breath, because breath holding against tension, a maneuver called the Valsalva maneuver, sharply amplifies the exact pressure spike we discussed, working directly against the mechanism instead of with it. Rest, then repeat until you've accumulated roughly 4 minutes of total hold time across the day. If you have uncontrolled high blood pressure, a history of heart disease, or you're simply unsure, this is worth a specific conversation with your doctor before starting, precisely because of that acute pressure rise during the hold itself. The long-term benefit is well documented, and the short-term spike is real too, and both being true at once is exactly the kind of nuance a rushed wellness video tends to skip. And to be equally honest about scope, a wall sit will not train your heart and lungs the way brisk walking or cycling does. It's a specific vascular tone effect, not a cardio replacement. So general aerobic activity recommendations are still worth meeting on top of this, not instead of it. Second, the 20 squats. And here's the direct link back to what we covered. Make them slow enough that you actually feel the burn build, not fast enough to lean on momentum instead of muscle. A 2 to 3 second lowering phase, a brief pause near the bottom of your comfortable range, then rising under control rather than a bounce. If your knees or balance make an unsupported squat risky, hold the back of a sturdy chair or use a chair seat as a target you tap and rise from. You're not cheating the exercise, you're preserving the same tension and loading signal while managing risk, which is the entire point. To be honest about what this will not do, 20 bodyweight squats a day will not build visibly larger muscles the way a structured program with added external weight would. It's a maintenance dose, enough to keep sending the signal that tells your body to hold on to this tissue, which for many people at this stage of life is the more urgent job than adding size. Third, sequence and pace them honestly. Doing the squats before the hold, rather than after, seems to prime and warm the tissue you're about to load statically, though I'll say plainly that this specific ordering hasn't been directly tested in the isometric research we discussed, so treat it as reasonable logic rather than a proven protocol. What matters far more than the order is simply showing up daily. The blood pressure trials that produced the numbers we covered ran for 8 weeks or longer before vessel level changes showed up reliably. If you do this for 4 days and check your blood pressure and see nothing different, that isn't the method failing. That's exactly how long real physiological adaptation takes, and expecting otherwise is a good way to quit right before the part where it actually starts working. Fourth, if you want real feedback instead of guessing, a home blood pressure cuff is worth the modest cost. Take a baseline reading before you start, then check again no sooner than 8 weeks in, at the same time of day, seated and rested for a few minutes first, since pressure swings enough across an ordinary day that a single reading taken right after climbing stairs tells you very little. And one honest note on individual variability. In every exercise trial ever run, some people's blood pressure responds more than others to the identical protocol, for reasons researchers don't fully understand yet. If your own numbers move less than the averages we discussed, that doesn't mean you did it wrong. It means you're a real person, not a study average. So go back to the very start of this. Your palms pressed together for those first 10 seconds. At the time, nothing appeared to be happening. Your hands stayed still, no muscle visibly grew, no number showed up on any screen. But underneath your skin, a hose was getting pinched and then released, a gas was diffusing into a vessel wall, an old reflex was being nudged toward a slightly lower resting setting. The same is true of every unhurried squat you'll ever do quietly in your own kitchen with nobody watching. A signal sent simultaneously to a nerve, a molecule, and a bone cell that have all been listening for exactly that kind of message since long before either of us was born. Nothing about getting older removes your body's ability to hear that signal. What tends to fade, almost always, is simply the sending of it. 4 minutes of stillness and 20 unglamorous squats aren't a transformation. They're a message, repeated daily, to tissue that was built to answer exactly that kind of asking. Your body never stopped listening as you aged. Most of us just quietly stopped speaking to it. You don't need a gym membership to start that conversation again, and you don't need to wait until tomorrow. You needed about 10 seconds, a wall, and a floor you can still get up from. Say something today, in a language written into you since before you had words for it, and notice, patiently, what answers back.